Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Ross, and I am the director of the Casden Institute and Dean's Professor of History at USC. And today we're honored to partner with Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion to bring to you an important and timely discussion on the current debate over the content of the California Ethnic Studies curriculum and the convergence of ethnic studies and Jewish studies. And just to give you a kind of background for today's discussion, the goal of California's ethnic studies curriculum is to increase the understanding of the state's ethnic minorities and to have them feel more included in the state's school system and in the state's history. And after state lawmakers required an ethnic studies curriculum, a panel of 20 ethnic studies scholars convened and drafted a version focused on four minority groups: African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans. And the curriculum they designed sought to discuss the experiences and contributions of each of those minorities, as well as the growth of their communities and the ongoing discrimination they have faced. However, when the first draft of the curriculum was released in the middle of 2019, Jewish organizations in the state and across the political spectrum were upset that it didn't include the experience of California Jews, which is home to more than 1 million Jews and contains two of the largest cities, Jewish cities, LA and San Francisco, outside of New York. Moreover, Jewish groups were upset that the curriculum didn't include, that it included a number of what they felt was anti-Israeli sections, such as the inclusion of BDS, that is Boycott, Divest, Sanction Movement, alongside Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And following a backlash that occurred to the first draft, the state's education department said it recognized changes were needed, but despite being considered an improvement over the initial iteration, the third draft still faces criticism from many sources. Well, this topic has been debated in many forums and publications, yet it seems to us there's been very little engagement amongst scholars of Jewish studies and ethnic studies. And today's panel will seek to redress this gap and aims to discuss the historical and contemporary relationship between ethnic studies programs and Jewish studies. And in turn, hopefully our panelists will help us model a civil discourse on this contentious issue. And on that last point, I want to make it clear that the mantra of every Casden event over the last 6-7 years has been to shed light, not heat, on topics of importance. And today is no different. We intend to engage in a respectful conversation, acknowledging that we may very well have different points of view, but that those points of view never get dealt with unless we can talk about them. Well, today's event is going to be moderated by my colleague, Sarah Bunin Benor. And Sarah is professor of contemporary Jewish studies at Hebrew Union College and adjunct professor of linguistics at USC. She received her PhD in linguistics from Stanford in 2004. And her research focuses on Jewish languages, American Jews, and sociolinguistics with an emphasis on ethnicity. And her most recent book, Hebrew Infusion, Language and Community at American Jewish Summer Camps, won the National Jewish Book Award in the category of Education and Jewish Identity. Now, a brief note for everyone in the audience on today's format. Sarah is going to begin our discussion by introducing our speakers. They will then talk to about, 4:45, 4:50, something like that. And then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for Q&A. You will be able to write your questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer as many of them as possible. So please try to make them questions rather than essays. With that, I introduce Sarah, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm really honored to be here, and I want to thank the Casden Institute and HUC for generously sponsoring this event, even knowing that it's a very contentious topic. So a little bit of background about how this panel came about. a few weeks ago, I read an article in Tablet magazine that expressed some concerns about the latest draft of the ethnic studies curriculum in California from a right-wing perspective. And then I realized I really don't know much about this. I've been hearing about it from time to time over the last few years, but I didn't really I hadn't done any research about it. So I started reading some articles, and I read another article that expressed some concerns about the curriculum from a left-wing perspective in Jewish Currents, which was written by one of our panelists, Gabby Kirk. And then I started watching panels and webinars and listening to podcasts. And I realized, wow, we are really having many conversations about this topic, but only in our bubbles. And so I realized that it's really important for us to get out of those bubbles. So that's when I approached the Casden Institute about planning this panel. And I'm so grateful that they were receptive to this idea. I'm also grateful to all the panelists for agreeing to participate in this. I'm also grateful to many of my colleagues in Jewish studies and ethnic studies for giving me tips about the panel and suggesting panelists and sending me resources. And I'm grateful to my colleagues in various Jewish organizations for doing the same. And I'm just so glad that we can have this conversation and really model bridge building and civil discourse around this contentious topic. So I want to start with the first panelist, Jeffrey Blutinger, who is the chair of Jewish studies and a professor of history at Cal State University in Long Beach. His PhD is in history from UCLA, and his research focuses on German Jewish history. And I'm going to ask each panelist in turn to say to speak for about 1 minute about how they got involved with this issue, the issue of the California Model Ethnic Studies curriculum, and also what role they have played or what stance they have taken in the conversations about that. So, Jeffrey, please go ahead.
So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Casden Institute for sponsoring this talk, or this panel, I should say. I got involved with this in 2019 when I read about the first draft of the model curriculum, which I strongly opposed. I submitted public comment opposing it, specifically on the issues of its continuing a pattern of isolating Jewish studies from ethnic studies and other ethnic studies programs, how it ignored anti-Semitism, which is a critical element of modern American racism, and how worse than simply ignoring Jews, the original model curriculum included false, misleading, and inaccurate information about Jews and about Israel, very strongly anti-Israel. I'm very, very pleased by the third iteration, the most recent iteration. Most of these problems have been addressed in that, so I'm quite happy with the current proposed curriculum.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Now we're going to turn it over to Nolan Cabrera. Nolan is an associate professor of educational policy studies and practice at the University of Arizona. His PhD is also from UCLA in higher education and organizational change, and his research focuses on Chicano studies and ethnic studies. Nolan.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for hosting this incredible this panel. And already we're going to start off with a little bit of a spirited disagreement. So I come at this from Tucson, Arizona, where we did have a model ethnic studies program that the state eventually banned back in 2012 or 2010. They passed a state law banning it. In the process of doing that, I was deeply involved in assessing the efficacy of said program, and in particular, which then led to me being testifying in the federal case, challenging the constitutionality of that law. And just to modify a little bit what Dr. Ross said at the beginning of the opening comments, it's not just about systemically marginalized students seeing themselves in the curriculum, but there's incredible educational opportunities through ethnic studies to really reinvigorate and give educational opportunities to students, in particular Black, Latinx, Native students, and Asian American students who haven't seen them materialize and not having to go down the road of remediation. And so I've been deeply involved. I know a lot of the people who were involved in the creation of the model curriculum, the first iteration of it, who have since disavowed the third iteration. And I'm actually extraordinarily disappointed because the third iteration has zero opportunities for the educational efficacy that critical ethnic studies offers. And so in many respects, what's happened because of this controversy, from my opinion, is that by watering this down and moving from critical ethnic studies to a more multicultural form, watered down multiculturalism, that it really sacrifices a lot of the educational opportunities for the students of color who this is really supposed to be supporting in the first place. So that's a primary concern and where I come at this situation from.
Thank you, Nolan. Next up is Marc Dollinger. He is Chair of Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. His PhD, also from UCLA, is in history, and his research is on Jews and the civil rights movement. Marc.
Good afternoon. Great to be here as well, following the tradition now of UCLA PhDs. I first was interested in ethnic studies as an undergrad at Berkeley. I studied with Carlos Munoz Jr. in his Chicano studies classes. That launched me into UCLA, where I worked in American Jewish history, Jews, and social justice causes. And my last book, I was interested in the Jewish ethnic revival of the late 60s and 70s, which included the development of Jewish studies. Didn't realize that I was actually writing a book on the impact of Black Power and Black Power ideology in American Jewish life. So I'm coming here from the historical perspective of the ways in which Jewish studies is actually born of ethnic studies. I think I'm somewhere in between my two colleagues, Jeffrey and Nolan, in that in the Cal State University system, I signed a solidarity letter with our College of Ethnic Studies to not include Jewish studies in that. At the high school level, though, for developmental reasons and others, I think that we need to center and amplify the 4 core groups while also ensuring that other groups are not suffering marginalization in the process.
Thank you. Next is Gabby Kirk. Gabby is a PhD candidate in geography at the University of California at Davis. And she's a reporter on ethnic study who has covered this topic in Jewish Currents. Her research focuses on geographies of colonialism and Palestinian farmers.
Thank you so much to Sarah and Steve and the USC Casden Center and Hebrew Union College. It's a little bit still surreal for me to be on a panel like this, based on both my scholarship as a Palestine studies scholar, as well as my personal activism for Palestinian rights for over a decade now. So I really appreciate this opportunity. As I said before, and as in my bio, I am a student of Palestine studies and also of Native American and Indigenous studies, particularly of feminist studies. My dissertation researches on questions of transnational solidarity between Palestinians and other peoples around the world, as well as the questions of indigeneity in the Middle East and questions of Palestinian and Jewish indigeneity. And I come at that questions of the way that nature, natural spaces, and science shape our ideas of race from the body up to the level of the state in my research. So that background from critical race and ethnic studies in a comparative lens, when the 2019 ethnic studies model curriculum was released and backlash started to come in, I had friends from my leftist Jewish communities texting me asking, well, why aren't Jews included in this? We are actually quite confused. We also believe anti-Semitism is, a form of racism in our world and that it should be analyzed. And that sent me on what has now been a series of articles, coverage for Jewish Currents magazine, which has been the only Jewish media outlet that actually has talked to the authors of the ethnic studies model curriculum and actually talked to scholars whose background is in ethnic studies and teachers whose backgrounds are in ethnic studies about how that curriculum came to be, and the question of why Arab American studies is so central and important and worth fighting for. So my stance on this is that Arab American studies is a crucial part of Asian American studies and has been for decades. Because Islamophobia as a form of racism has been deeply tied to other both examples of anti-Asian racism, from connections between the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Muslim ban, or Japanese American internment in World War II and the rounding up of South Asian, Arab, and Muslim men after 9/11, as well as the questions of histories of impacts of US war and empire from Pacific Islands to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, drone strikes in Afghanistan, and the current wars in the Middle East. There are connections on the grassroots level and on the level of the state that has racialized those communities in a lot of connected ways. And at the same time, I absolutely support analyzing anti-Semitism as a form of racism through critical race and ethnic studies approaches and pedagogies. But I feel that the ways that it has been put into the current draft of the curriculum are more excuses to put forth, as Nolan rightfully said, a multicultural or diversity studies curriculum that is often trying to suppress Palestinian narrative and voices rather than actually asking critically, what can we do to think Jewish and ethnic studies together?
Thank you, Gabby. My first question after the introductions goes to Nolan. Nolan, you mentioned in your introduction that you mentioned a distinction between ethnic studies and multiculturalism, and I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit and also explain why it's called ethnic studies if it seems to be really about critical race studies.
So I really appreciate the question because it allows me to kind of clarify some of these issues that we're talking about. So ethnic studies coming out of the civil rights movement were demands by grassroots communities to open up university and educational spaces to represent the knowledge bases of systemically marginalized people, in particular Native American, Asian American, Mexican American, Latinx, and Black African American communities. And that's the nature of the struggle. And it was not meant to be a celebration of heroes and holidays and foods and fiestas and, hey, you know, I'm different, you're different, we're all good, and we're going to sing Kumbaya. It was meant as a way of analyzing systemic inequalities and inequities in society, and then also connecting educational institutions to said communities and really strategizing around ways that educational institutions can not just be no longer be complicit in maintaining systemic inequities, but actually using them as leverage to do something and promote more democratic space in our society. But it makes people feel very uncomfortable when we talk about inequities because it's very easy to say the marginalized group. In Tucson, it's those poor brown kids on the South Side. When I was at UCLA, it was always, oh, those kids in South LA. But these are relational terms. You can't have a marginalized group if you don't also have a privileged group in the process. And once you start having that as a holistic analysis, it makes folks feel attacked, even though it's, again, addressing a system of inequities. And really, that's where the efficacy in the programs lie. That when you look at the data about ethnic studies, in particular, the two large quantitative studies that came out of this, the one out of Tucson that I did and the one that Deanne Penner did out of Stanford regarding San Francisco Unified, it wasn't a multicultural curriculum. And as a matter of fact, sometimes multicultural curricula are not seen as effective. It's the critical component that centers systemic inequities that leads to massive gains in educational in education, whether it be GPA, graduation, attendance, or even students seeing themselves as producers of knowledge, seeing their communities as producers of knowledge. And so it's a very fine distinction, but it's a very important one. And I think that the term ethnic studies is actually a bit of a misnomer, but we're using it as a method of explicitly, because it would imply sort of, hey, ethnic studies, cultural difference, and imply multiculturalism, when in fact that was the name that was given to this area of studies coming out of the 1960s movements. And so in many respects, even though it's slightly inaccurate, it still is an homage to the activism that led to this area of studies in the first place, and remembering that historical legacy and the reason why it existed in the first place.
Thank you. Marc, can you please give us a little historical background? You studied the 1960s about how ethnic studies came about and what role Jewish studies has played within the academy and within ethnic studies or tangential to ethnic studies.
Yeah, thank you. If I can follow up just on what Nolan said as well, there's so much confusion among American Jews, or at least California Jews, around this term ethnic studies, because Jews are an ethnic group. So Jewish studies, therefore, is ethnic studies, and therefore should be inside, right? In fact, historically, this is not how it played out. In fact, the stories I heard on my campus, during from the student strike, is it was third world studies to begin with, and then ethnic studies came in as sort of a compromise measure. In the 1950s, there was a large assimilation among white Jews who were able to move to the suburbs because the anti-Semitic housing covenant restrictions had been lifted. This is before the racist restrictions, right, were lifted. And the idea was in the 1950s for American Jews, generally speaking, to do all they could to blend in to the white Christian society around them. There was much less activism in terms of centering one's Jewish identity. Then the social protest movements of the 60s, and I argue that it was the Black Power movement which really led so many different ethnic, racial, gender groups to be public. And the Soviet Jewry movement begins, and American Zionism after the Six-Day War picks up. There's a Jewish religious revival. And there is a call among undergraduates to be like Black Studies. And it was actually Black Studies that at UC Berkeley, for example, that started things, and at SF State. And Jewish students demanded that their parents' generation step up. And they were unapologetic about bringing their identities and the politics around their identities into public. So in one sense, Jewish studies was created with a page from the Strategy Handbook of Ethnic Studies. In the very first meeting of the Association for Jewish Studies, 1969, for example, there was a requirement that you had to be Jewish to be in Jewish studies. That's changed now, but that's to go to the identity focus of Jewish studies. Historically, though, Jewish studies has never seen itself, at least on the university campus in a disciplinary way, to be part of the College of Ethnic Studies. I'm speaking now of white Jews, are not part of the four original groups. At San Francisco State, we're housed in the College of Liberal and Creative Arts, not in the College of Ethnic Studies, because I think, as Nolan has articulated, the story of ethnic studies and those four groups has had a different American historical experience than most American Jews. And even as American Jews borrowed from and emulated the model of ethnic studies, we've actually been quite distinct from a bureaucratic point of view, as well as from an historical one.
So Jeffrey, if you could explain a little bit about how ethnic studies works at your university and the place of Jewish studies within it, that would be great. And in particular, are there ethnic studies requirements that some Jewish studies classes can fulfill?
Can I actually go back and take issue with some stuff that has been said before and then answer your question? Okay, so I would suggest that Jewish studies predates is the original ethnic studies program, and that was founded in the 1810s by graduate students in Berlin at University of Berlin, who wanted to take the study of Jews away from a white Christian European scholarship and use it to try to advance this cause of civil rights for Jews in Europe, to get Jews emancipated from the various racial, well, we would racial later, but discriminatory and literal ghettoizations that had existed at the time. And the struggle for Jewish studies to gain academic acceptance has took more than a century before the appointment of the first professor of Jewish studies, which at Columbia in the 1920s. And in fact, there were, I think, several dozen Jewish studies programs in existence in 1965 or so, 66, when Arnie Band wrote an article on the development of Jewish studies programs in the US, mostly coming out of Near Eastern languages and cultures. So that's just a little bit. I think that Jewish studies has a lot in common with the ethnic studies programs that developed later in the US. Now, in terms of the way it works in our campus and in the CSU, is that since 1969, ethnic studies has excluded Jewish studies. On my campus, the original president of this university, Cal State Long Beach, Victor Peterson, refused to hire Jews. Only 2 Jews got hired during his term as president, mostly because they snuck past him. One of them, Ed Karabenik, just passed away. And I asked Ed, he was in the Department of Geography, and I asked him, how did he get past Peterson? And he said, Peterson thought I was Armenian. So yeah, I have been, as the chair of Jewish studies, I have been trying to work with the other ethnic studies programs and departments to no effect. I am always excluded, even though I face many of the same issues that they face in terms of being a small program with not a lot of students and very little, I get 0 stateside support. So the university's been trying to eliminate me as a degree granting institution since 2006. So we were sort of on the cutting edge of the assault on ethnic studies programs at the time. In terms of what we offer in Jewish studies, it's a multi-department program in which we're now housed in 2 primary departments, history and religious studies. We used to have a whole bunch of courses in comparative world literature. However, all those faculty who taught them have since retired or didn't get tenure. And so I had to, those are now options on the rare occasion those courses are listed. But yeah, so we're mostly I think I might get students but in terms of the various ethnic studies and in terms of AB 1460, the new ethnic studies requirement, none of my classes in Jewish studies are listed as fulfilling any ethnic studies requirements by any of the 4 other official ethnic studies departments.
Thanks, Marc. Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you. So, I'll agree and disagree with my colleague from Long Beach State. He's absolutely right in terms of the origins of Jewish studies, going back to the scientific study of Judaism in Europe and its development here in the US. For me, as an historian, it's about causality. What caused the tremendous growth of Jewish studies programs in the university from the mid-60s on. And I locate that in the politics of the 60s, even as, of course, there are antecedents earlier than that. And then to Nolan's earlier comment and the question on the difference between multicultural studies and ethnic studies, at San Francisco State, I hope and think we're a generation ahead in that we have a requirement called American Religious and Ethnic Minorities. And Jewish studies counts there. And we have a requirement called social justice, and my courses in Jewish studies count there. And we also have a College of Ethnic Studies, and I'm like, okay, Jewish studies doesn't actually need to count there given the divergent histories of those 2 points. So I think a lot of the campuses also have different approaches to it as well.
Nolan, would you mind explaining a little bit about how this differs at the college versus the high school levels, the issue of whether Jewish studies should be included in ethnic studies, or whether they count for requirements at the college level, but might or might not be included in a class in a high school setting?
Absolutely. Historically, that there isn't much division. There was more that there was a massive push for ethnic studies in the 1960s, and as it was taken up in both K-12 education as well as higher education. Actually, it was more taken up within institutions of higher education. And then we've seen a number of K-12 programs, districts, and now states taking up this mantle. But it's very much along the same lines, the 4 core groups, and then centering systemic inequities. I think that in this, that it's a very, I think it's important to remember the historical legacy, because what we're seeing right now, when people misinterpret what ethnic studies is, then because again, it implies ethnicity, then everybody tries to get a seat at the table. And then that's what we're seeing here, is that one of the most promising educational developments of probably the last 2 or 3 decades is now being completely derailed and has no real recognizable relationship to what it should be, because everybody, it's not just that it's getting watered down, but it's necessarily kicking out certain perspectives. And it's really sad to see that, I mean, on a very practical, tangible level, our dear Black, Brown, Native, and Asian American students in the K-12 are the ones who are going to suffer as a result of this political bickering up on high.
Oh, thank you. Jeffrey, I know that you said at the beginning that you felt that Jews should be included in ethnic studies. Can you say a little bit more about why you think that and how that relates to power dynamics and discussions of structural racism and anti-Semitism?
Thank you. So I've got an article coming out this month on a racist professor, one of the leading academic anti-Semites in America, who used to teach in my college. And his ideas are at the core. He's one of the founders of the alt-right. And if you spend any time studying the contemporary racism in America and the alt-right, you will find that Jews are at the heart of their conception of the racial struggle in the US, and that anti-Semitism plays a critical role. And you cannot understand racism in the US if you exclude anti-Semitism. You can't understand what happened at Charlottesville in 2017, why they are chanting with their tiki torches at this Horst Wessel luau, Jews will not replace us, if you don't understand how the critical role of anti-Semitism. So the exclusion of Jews and anti-Semitism from a discussion of racism in America and through an ethnic studies curriculum does a disservice to all students in the state by not giving them the tools to understand what's actually going on.
Okay, thanks. Does anybody want to respond to that? Gabby, in particular, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually agree here. I do think that anti-Semitism as a form of racism, as well as contributing to the racial formation actually of Jews, of course, whether white or non-white, but also just the question of the formation of race in the crucible of Europe, with Jews as the original internal other that is then exported through colonialism and colonial genocide since Christopher Columbus sailed over. Like, these are pertinent questions. My issue is less with analyzing anti-Semitism or even the white nationalist examples that Jeffrey brought up, but that the current draft of the curriculum eschews analyzing that for definitions of anti-Semitism that really target Palestine solidarity activism quite strongly, as well as questions of trying to cast all Jews as non-white, and therefore all Jews as part of an internal victimhood of anti-Semitism. It exceptionalizes anti-Semitism instead of thinking of it as part of the forms of racism that have co-constituted each other in the US historically and today, right? Like, we always have to know of race itself as historically and socially contextual, as a relation that is not eternal across all space and time. The question of who Jews are is no different. And you see that in examples like on the latest draft, the curriculum was added to say that originally it said Asian American and Pacific Islander studies has grown to incorporate various subfields as a means of including groups that have been historically marginalized and understudied within the fields, such as Arab American studies. And the current draft now, and actually a fourth draft just came out yesterday, so this is the latest quote. This is the one that the Department of Education will be discussing and voting on at their meeting next week. The latest draft says, such as Arab American studies and Jewish American studies. Jewish American studies is now within Asian American studies. Are all Jews Asian? This isn't our racial position in the US, and unless you are an Asian Jew, of which we have many, but the racial position of Jews in the US is something that can and should be discussed, studied, taught to students at all age levels. The way that this current curriculum is doing that, in which it takes concepts like intersectionality and applies it to identities rather than systems of oppression, right? The questions of intersectionality is, how do multiple interlocking systems of oppression interact and shape our lives, rather than how do different identity categories do that. Do you see the difference? And that's really important when we think about the hot button issues in our world today, that our students understand things beyond the individual identity level to understand issues of collective power and collective struggle. And that's what ethnic studies teaches from a pedagogical perspective. And that's totally friendly to studies of anti-Semitism, I want to be clear, but it needs to come from that perspective. I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to turn it to the other three panelists and ask, where do you think Jews should fit within the four traditional fields of ethnic studies? But before we get to that, maybe Nolan, if you could just explain why these four fields are the ones that are included and how Arab American studies ended up in Asian American studies within those four fields.
The last part of your question is a little bit beyond my pay grade, but in terms of the first part, the four, I'm going to be repeating myself slightly, but I think it is a point worth repeating, that it stemmed from the grassroots struggles of the 1960s. These are the demands that students and community activists were making upon both institutions of higher education and K-12 institutions to create critical analyses and valid around issues of systemic inequities and racism, as well as validating the knowledge that originated from said communities within these spaces, in particular higher education. As a consequence of that, I mean, that's where a lot of that's where ethnic studies came out of. That's the historical legacy that we're honoring, and it's like I said, that's the core of it. That's the way that ethnic studies has been historically. And again, now the other issue right now is that ethnic studies in modern times, especially in a K-12 context, is actually seen as a way of addressing systemic inequities in educational systems. And so it requires us to really ask deeply why the educational outcomes for Latinx students are so low relative to their white peers. That why are Black students being pushed out and in institutions of education of the prison industrial pipeline. It requires us to ask very, very difficult questions around race and oppression in contemporary society. And doing it in a way that can A, help increase student achievement, and B, doesn't do so in a remedial way. Like anytime that there's a meaningful K-12 ethnic studies program that comes out, it sees the students as producers of knowledge. And I mean, they would call it, in Tucson, they call them barrio scholars because it's largely Mexican-American population. And by doing that and not seeing them as remedial classes, it actually creates this sense of student empowerment and creates a sense of, I can actually do this, and starts to reform a student's relationship with school. And what we're not addressing right now, especially as it pertains to K-12 education, is that it is a horrible experience for a lot of racially minoritized students because A, they're not in the curriculum, B, they're frequently blamed for their own historical marginalization, and C, they don't really have any tools to address this. It's just, when the issue of race does come up, it tends to be a watered down multiculturalism. Like, hey, you're different, I'm different, and doesn't give them a sense of why we're here, and more importantly, what can we do about systemic inequities. And once students start analyzing that, then they actually become engaged in, there's a larger purpose to their work. And that's part of the reason why this is so important, is that as we're talking about these groups, we're also talking about contemporarily systemically marginalized people. And it doesn't discount anti-Semitism in any way, shape, or form, but it says that there are unique positions, both historically and contemporarily, that we're dealing with here.
Yeah, thanks, Nolan. You said that it would be problematic if they didn't see themselves in the curriculum, but then that leads to the question of, well, aren't Jews excluded from the curriculum in the first draft, and aren't many groups excluded from the curriculum, including white students, right? Can you just address that really quick, and then we'll get to the other panelists?
When it comes to white students, there is already a representation in the curriculum. They just don't, what we call traditional US history is white history. The founding fathers are white men. So, that this is already pre-existing. At the same time, historically, that there have been some major attempts in K-12 education to include analyses and experiences and perspectives of Jewish people. In particular, I remember very vividly when I was a child, that shoot, I learned more about Anne Frank than I did about Cesar Chavez. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying that there are already a lot of curriculum that do focus on the Jewish American experience and the Jewish experience internationally. And in terms of real meaningful analyses of the status of systemically marginalized peoples in society, racially marginalized people in our society, they're just not they're not included in this way. It is a little disruptive to have a curriculum like the Model 1 that we're talking about. But unfortunately, there already has been a lot more inclusion along these lines that I think it's kind of a false binary. I hear this a lot, if we're going to have ethnic studies, what about whiteness studies? Well, I actually teach a class in whiteness studies, and we call it a critical analysis of American history. So, we need to be clear about what we're talking about in these ways. And it's sort of like, it's that old adage that when privilege is normal, equity feels like oppression. And in many respects, that's what a lot of the backlash against the model curriculum, the earlier iterations is rooted in.
Thank you. Jeffrey, can you address that, please?
Okay, so on the question, going back to your original question about the how do Jews and Arab Americans fit into the 4 categories being put under the Asian studies category, I do think I actually don't like that. I don't think it makes sense to include either Jews or Arab Americans under the Asian category, since both Jews and Arab Americans don't all come from Asia. They come from all, I would actually create a category called the Middle East and put Jews and Arab studies, Jewish studies and Arab studies in that category. I think part of the problem here is that we're locked into a model from 1969, from 50 years ago. Those were the 4 groups in 1969 that came together that ultimately founded what's now the College of Ethnic Studies. And so that becomes the model, and we're trying to shoehorn all these other groups into it and make that fit rather than address the original conception. In terms of, I think what I was going to say. I was going to say something else and it just flew out of my head. And so I will, I'll stop and let someone else go on.
Okay, let's turn it to Gabby and then Marc. Oh, okay, Gabby is.
I can hear you. Can you
Okay.
hear me okay?
Yeah,
Thanks.
go ahead.
Technical difficulties, but just in the nick of time. The field of ethnic studies, of critical ethnic studies, that word critical at the beginning, has itself actually already moved beyond these 4 categories as static and unchanged. Some of the most exciting work coming out in this field is questions of the comparative and the transnational. The idea, for instance, of Chicano identity as something that is like static and unchanged when it's actually deeply tied to questions of indigeneity, as well as questions of Europe and whiteness, is one that is under conversation, as well as Arab Americans who, for instance, under the US Census, have the options of choosing white or African American if they're from North Africa, which of course we know that that's not what is meant by that category on our census. So the question of whiteness that is actually present in all of this is actually a sticky one. The issue is that this curriculum, as it currently stands, is a missed opportunity to critically analyze the way that whiteness and white supremacy affects many of the groups that we've listed, because it goes for a much more friendly to neoliberal structures in our state way of representation and identity. And these questions of where Jews fit or where Arab Americans fit or anything really evades the larger question, which is ethnic studies is not about identity. It's about structures and systems of oppression that affect identity formation and racial formation, but is not the same thing and cannot be reduced to that. And so the thing is, though, is just to say, though, in defense of Asian American studies departments, for instance, at University of Illinois, Chicago, have housed Arab American studies programs for decades. They have presented together at conferences. They have the Asian American Studies Association was one of the first to call for academic boycott of Israel. There's a long history of Palestine solidarity within Asian American studies. And while I don't think anyone would say that all Arab Americans are Asian, or even that that's the accurate quote unquote racial categorization of them, part of the Middle East is in Western Asia. And there's a push, as someone who's a scholar of Middle Eastern studies, to question the way that that categorization is coming out of US Cold War ideologies. And before that, as Edward Said was telling us, European Orientalism doesn't actually quite capture what it means to be Arab or from the region either. And so I think that, again, these are conversations that are ongoing. These don't have to be settled questions to teach our K through 12 youth about these issues. I think that, unfortunately, though, in trying to push very narrow notions, it actually forecloses the fact that our students are very capable of dealing with these messiness. They actually really are. They're dealing this anyway in their lives. And so in pushing things like the removal of Palestine from the curriculum, it's actually foreclosed the ways for students to be able to talk to each other about how this comes up in their own lives or in their families, or how they've seen it play out in media or in politics. It closes off more conversations, unfortunately, than it opens. And keeping Arab American studies in quite strongly would allow for more open conversations, whether among Jewish students, Arab students, or anyone else.
Okay, thanks. Marc, I think you have a lot of things to respond to that have been said in the last few minutes.
That's right. Actually, I want to, what Gabby said just now, and also the first time around on racialization, I find this fascinating. I don't know if we're talking past each other or just looking from different angles or perspectives. One of the critiques I had when the debate began about including the Jews was the fact that that slogan actually assumes Jewish whiteness, in that there are Black Jews and Latinx Jews and Asian American and Indigenous Jews who are already part of ethnic studies, who have intersectional identities, and who become erased when the language is include Jews in ethnic studies. So as I have been sort of teaching and talking about it, I've sort of focused on the need to center and amplify the experiences of Jews of color in the intersectionality of it. And this, I think, is where anti-Semitism comes in a way, even in addition to what Jeffrey argued as well, as a root of racism. And then on Arab American, there are Jews indigenous to Middle East and North Africa who are Arabic speaking, Arab culture immersed, and in the same ways that Jews who are identified in those four groups are already included in ethnic studies. I would argue that this is another group of Jews. So I would not be contending that there's an attempt to get all American Jews as if they're in those groups. In fact, it's not, maybe 12 to 15% as best we can guess from the four original groups. And if we add Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, it's going to go much higher, although of course, whether one identifies as a Jew of color is an even more complicated idea. And I want to put all this out there to say that I don't think we should be presupposing our conversation on an assumption of Jewish whiteness, which is not to say that Jews who are presenting as white aren't, but it is to say that it is a diverse Jewish community. And in the complexity of what's going on, I think for California Jews especially, to open up the conversation and the debate with a sensitivity to the way in which even the way we meaning white Jewish scholars, are constructing our language is itself making an assumption of whiteness.
Thank you. Well, I know all the panelists have more to say right now, but we have to move to the Q&A. And so maybe what you have to say will be able to be raised as part of that. There's a question about why Mizrahi Jews, Armenians, and Iranians were left out of the first draft while Arabs were included. Isn't that inconsistent and unjustified and shouldn't all be included? Who wants to address that one?
I'll just say yes.
Jeffrey, yes.
Yes, that's very simple. I would say yes. And I just point out that if we're thinking about California communities of Jews, just a reminder that here in Los Angeles County, we have very large communities of Israeli and Persian Jews who are major communities. And I think the issue to Marc's last point about intersectionality, yes, Latinx Jews, Asian Jews, African-American Jews are all there in the ethnic studies, but their Jewishness is not discussed. That is, they're treated only as African Americans and not as Jews. I'll stop here.
Gabby, you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, going off what was said before by Marc and Jeffrey, I do think that there's a need to think through questions of anti-Semitism and other forms of racism together. So for instance, when we're talking about Black-Jewish relations, which presupposes a monolithic white Jewish community and a monolithic non-Jewish Black community, that makes us think that anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism are two separate forces, that maybe if you're a Black Jew, both of them act on you, when actually Black Jews have been saying quite firmly, you can't disentangle our experiences. That's what intersectionality is. That is actually when Kimberly Crenshaw has the metaphor of an intersection where you have a car accident and you don't actually know which car hit who, right? And so I think that it's an important approach to think ethnic studies and Jewish studies from Jews of color stories first. Marc, I totally agree with you. This question of why weren't Iranian, Armenian, or Mizrahi Jews included, quote unquote, it's part of a larger anti-Middle East studies push. We see this, for instance, with the lawsuit against the Title VI Center at UCLA and at Duke, to say that racial or ethnic minorities in the Middle East are being persecuted by a form of Arab imperialism. This is historically false, and it is almost always used to prop up larger support for things like US intervention in the region. Devin Narr, who actually is both quoted in the current model curriculum and also said that his materials were not being used in the way that he felt that they should be used in that curriculum, in my Jewish Currents article, points out that there is the need to ask both how, for instance, Mizrahi Jews are racialized in Israel, and then there's connected but different histories of Arab Jews who came straight to the US, which is to say that Arab Jews faced a lot of discrimination within Jewish communities and also were racialized as Arab. Not necessarily as Arab Jews, were racialized as Orientals. And then that's a different from the story of Mizrahi Jews who went from the Arab world to Israel first and then from Israel to the US. Here's the thing, this is a lot to cover. This is a lot to cover for me, and I am someone who is a scholar currently in these issues. I think that a good faith effort to include questions of Arab Jewry in Arab American studies is welcome, and there's wonderful scholars who are doing that and have been doing that for years, for instance, Ella Shohat. Unfortunately, the efforts of lobbying to include a separate lesson plan just on communities like that was not really engaging robustly with theories from Arab American studies. I have learned more about anti-Semitism in a lot of ways from my Palestinian teachers and colleagues, because you can't separate the racialization of Jews from the racialization of Palestinians.
So another question is about BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And the question is, why is it included in the original curriculum if the original curriculum was about America and BDS is an international issue? Let's see, who would like to address that one? Nolan, do you want to address that?
Sure. I disagree in the sense that it's an international only issue. As Gabi rightly pointed out, that one of the very first professional scholarly organizations to come out in favor of BDS was an Asian American Studies group, and as a number of ethnic studies oriented scholars and scholarly organizations are very much rooted in connections between people and the land, there's been different affinities that have grown out of that. In Chicano studies, you have the issue of Mexican Americans being displaced through Aztlan. You have indigenous studies, westward expansion, manifest destiny, and issues of colonialism that play out in those spaces. And so in a lot of these disciplines, that there's been a natural connection between in both between their orientation and solidarity internationally. In many respects, as other groups have had international solidarity with localized movements in the United States around racial equity. And so I think it also speaks to Gabby's earlier point that this is part of the evolution of ethnic studies and taking a more international perspective while still trying to understand racialization as it pertains to the U.S. locally. So that's my understanding of the rationale for inclusion is along a lot of those lines.
Okay, I think other panelists might have something to say about that as well. Anyone want to add to that?
I'll jump in, and if I can even push it a step further and try to get to what is an essential question, at least that I'm hearing and that I'm doing a lot of thinking on. On my campus at San Francisco State, we have students who interpret Zionism as redemption, religious redemption, national redemption, that is to their identity true. And we have students on my campus who see Zionism, who read it as death. What do we do as an educational institution when some of our students read it as redemption, what other students read as death? And then we move it to a K-12 environment. And now we're going to introduce BDS, which is contested, certainly, on what it means and what it's saying and what it's doing. And the question to me is in, let's say, a high school classroom, and we're going to have a model curriculum, and the state of California is going to approve it. What do we do when we have a subject that to one student, and you can flip any way you want, pick your students and the issue, right? What are we going to do when one student's redemption is another student's death? And that to me is the most vexing challenge pedagogically. I just take the easy way out because at the university, it's an easier thing to manage. But in a California state required curriculum that's going to go back into the elementary ages, I struggle with what it's like for that student who is going to be marginalized by whatever it is. In this case, we can say BDS, but I open that up to anything.
I actually don't struggle with it. I think that having an overt BDS, pro-BDS curriculum, which is really about eliminating the state of Israel, is not appropriate within the K through 12 curriculum, taking that kind of side. I would remind you that the original curriculum was grossly misrepresented what BDS is, presenting it only as a challenge to the Israeli government and companies associated with it for the occupation, while omitting the fact that in fact, BDS treats all of Israel as occupied territory, including all the land from 1948, and it wants to sever all ties with all Israelis, not just those Israelis who live on the West Bank or who have companies on the West Bank. So I was very happy to see that that language was taken out after the first draft.
Gabby?
Yeah. The first draft had BDS mentioned twice, one as a topic of Arab American studies and as one of the largest social movements arising from Arab communities internationally. That's a valid topic to explore. And second was through a social movements and student civic engagement lesson plan. That lesson plan is still in the current draft, but it was listed as a possible social movement to analyze. All of the social movements have now been removed. And that lesson plan included the question, why might people have different responses to social movements? So as Marc pointed out, it was already baked into the lesson plan for students to be able to ask, why might students have different reaction to BDS depending on where they're coming from? However, the anti-BDS position of mainstream Jewish institutions to remove it as a topic of conversation has actually meant that all of the social movements other than Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock were removed from that. So a lot of stuff was swept up in that censorship. We don't have time for me to deal with the myths of the question of what BDS is calling for. But needless to say, Palestinians have the right to tell their stories in their voices. Ethnic studies supports that, and it's a shame that it gets demonized as anti-Semitic as a Jew who's been doing BDS work for many years now.
Thank you. We have time for just one more question, and I want to address this to Nolan. Nolan, the question is, do you think there might be different approaches to dealing with these issues state by state and school by school, given local experiences and track records of addressing or not anti-Semitism, of addressing or not the experiences of BIPOC people?
I think that that's a really complicated question. I get a little bit triggered when I hear that, because immediately I hear Ronald Reagan on my shoulder saying states' rights, and I don't. That really that may be something good in California, but when we're coming over to Arizona, it becomes very problematic in that way. However, I mean, the states are in charge of their curriculum, and I think that I mean, I think it's kind of a moot point, because it just is like that. No matter how much I get very concerned about intrusion from the state government into these issues, as we had. I mean, we had the banning of the most highly successful K-12 ethnic studies program in the entire country in Arizona. I was here to witness and be part of that entire thing. And so but I don't want to be an absolutist one way or another, say it should be in the states, it should only be in local districts, because I think that there's validity in both. But I also think that it's also important to dialogue across those two areas, because in certain areas you can have very high, say, Latinx populations, but they don't necessarily have a lot of control of the school boards, of the local governments, and as a consequence of that, their educational needs are not going to be met in this. And that's why I was extraordinarily disappointed in these attacks on the model curriculum, because for me it wasn't just about the way that the attacks played out on the curriculum. It wasn't just about adding a couple of people here and there, adding new groups here and there, but it was really about transforming and disrupting what was already put in place, and really undermining the intentionality of it. And so that for me has been really concerning as we're going through here. That again, going back to the issue of educational efficacy, that we had this possibility of having a massive scaffolding that could really serve the needs of the students who are worse served by the current educational system. And then because of this really strong political maneuvering, I got to be honest, it's pretty weak charges of anti-Semitism against the founders of this, and I'm really concerned that organizing around those lines and not really seeing what was in there, and not really taking account of what was in that model curriculum, has led to, like I said, the dissolving and complete transformation of a program, to the point that the original authors won't have their names associated with it anymore. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's our students of color in California schools who are suffering as a result of it. And that, I think, is what we need to keep asking. I know that there's the question about where does Jewish studies fit within ethnic studies, but the politics that have played out have necessarily harmed minoritized students in the state of California. And that should be the subject, that should be the center, that should be the focus of what we're talking about here.
Thank you, Nolan. Now, I know that everyone has a lot more to say about this, and I want to thank all of the people who are writing excellent questions and comments in the chat, and I will be sure to share all of those with our panelists so that they'll get to see them and consider them for future conversations. And I do hope there will be future conversations, because I think this really can be a model of how we can have a civil, respectful conversation about a contentious topic, and how we can build bridges between what might normally be bubbles. So I'm going to turn it over now to Steve Ross. You're muted, Steve.
I forgot to unmute myself. So I want to thank Sarah, Jeffrey, Marc, Gabi, Nolan for a very enlightening and timely discussion, and I'm very grateful for your willingness to share your thoughts with us. And I want to thank Hebrew Union College for partnering with the Casden Institute. But I do want to take one moment to simply say that these are all important issues about which we can disagree, and in fact we should disagree until we get it right, until No one is 100% satisfied, but no one is 100% dissatisfied. Because I want to remind us all that we need to focus on the big picture. And sometime in these debates, I think we miss the big picture. And what is the big picture? When minority groups fight amongst themselves, the beneficiaries are white supremacists. Let me tell you something. On January 6th, 2021, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, Jewish Americans, Arab Americans were not part of the America that those who marched on the Capitol, the insurrectionists, the traitors to their nation, none of those groups were part of the America that they envisioned. And I would argue from 1865, and then again in 1945, we have been refighting a civil war. And when politicians tell us, let's put the past behind us, that does a damage to all of us. And that's why getting an ethnic studies program right matters, because it's about understanding who true Americans are. They're all of us. And when we begin to fight about which minority is the more oppressed one, again, we simply play in the hands of white supremacists. On that note, I want to thank our audience for coming today, for taking the time, and I look forward to seeing you all again at future Casden and Hebrew Union College events. Thank you and have a good evening, everyone.